and we can have then more time for any questions you may have. Thanks for starting the recording. With us started, you need to make sure we can access everything at the end. We'll have more time afterwards for questions, and I hope that you will also be able to start logging in and create your account and potentially start populating your Eithics application. So I'm going to share my screen now. Actually, I'm going to, before sharing my screen, I'm going to, let's forget that for 2 seconds. I'm going to send you my slides in the chat. I think that's going to be easier, so that you can hopefully follow what's going on in my presentations, but you also have them and you can play with them later. There are links there, so they might work better if you want to look at them at a slightly different speed than me. Okay, so on the chat, you should have my slides in the next couple of minutes. Okay, they are almost there. It's a little bit of a heavy file, and I'm going to share them now as well. So what I want to discuss with you is Eithics applications and how to go through them. Hopefully you can all see everything. If you have an issue, just shout, because I cannot see the chat anymore. So there are lots of links which are quite useful and clear, I think. The first one here, ethics.coventry.ac.uk, is the link to the system. Okay, so that's where you will create your application. That's where you will see comments, feedback on your application. That's where you will be able to download the certificate saying that you got Eithics approval, etc., etc. On that same link, you see that they all start with the same thing. You have some guides. So I'll briefly show you some of those, and they are already open here. So the first one is a presentation of the system itself. Okay, and we're not going to cover everything in details here because you can go through it yourself. But basically, you will see it's a very intuitive system. And the first thing you will have to do, and we can do that at the end of this session, is creating your profile. Okay, to create your profile, you basically will have to put your name, your faculty, your school, so FBL, Faculty of Business and Law, SMM, and you will have to select a supervisor. So normally you've been sent your supervisor, otherwise we can discuss at that time. And then you will have access to an application where you can create your new project. And I'm just scrolling there through the things, but you see that there are very clear guidance on the different fields and how you populate them and technical support. Okay. Now, the other thing I wanted to show you is submitting an Eithics application. So again, this is a very clear guide, which is on the Eithics website, and you now have the link to it. And it basically tells you how to create an application once you've got your account. So you click simply on creating a new project here, and then you will start seeing a number of things that you will have to populate. Okay. The module codes for this module is 7012 SMM. Once you create your project, you will be allocated a project number, and you will be able to go through the process. So we can go back on that later. And finally, the last link on this first page is about the whole process of ethical approval. It provides you quite a lot of details. I'm going to cover some of those key points now, but I think the key things I wanted to show you is that slide toward the end, which shows you okay, it's actually maybe on that one, which shows you what your applications go through. Okay, so hopefully you can see my screen now. If you're planning to collect secondary data, you will submit your application, then your supervisor will review it, and it's likely to be considered as low risk, and then it will therefore be automatically finalized once it's approved by your supervisor. If you collect some primary data, it's likely that after the approval by your supervisor, it will have to go through me or one of my colleagues as ethics lead to review. And then again, it will be approved, okay? When we receive your application, so once you submit it, there's nothing you can do about it. You lose contact, you lose all editing right. So what we'll do is we'll go through it, and if there is any feedback or comments, we'll send it back to you, asking you to revise it and resubmit it, okay? So the wording has changed a little bit. It's not rejected, it's sent back for revision and resubmissions, and you will have comments. I'm not going to discuss these further. I'm going to summarize the key points now. And afterwards, at the end of this presentation, I will just let you explore, and I will stay online and we can have Q&A. Hopefully, you had a few sessions already on research methods, and you may understand the difference between secondary data and primary data. But just to clarify, secondary data is data which has already been collected by others. So typically, you can think of literature, published academic papers, historical documents, websites. So anything which is in the public domain, any archival data is likely to be there. Potentially, you will also have some private data sets. And I guess the most typical example of that would be if you are doing an internship, and to conduct your internship, you are going to use data which has been collected over the years or very recently by your organization, okay? This is data which is already there, so it's secondary, but for which you need an authorization because it's not in the public domain, okay? So in that case, you will need a letter from the organization allowing you to use the data for research purpose. If you are using only secondary data, your research is very likely low risk, okay, because you are not collecting data as such. However, you still need to submit an ethics application, okay? So everything we are going to cover today, you still need to do, but it's going to be much more straightforward for you. Your application is going to be a lot easier and a lot simpler. I think one of the key things I really also need to emphasize on is if you collect data from social media, it is usually not considered as secondary data, okay? And I'm particularly thinking here of marketing students. You might be interested in looking at how people interact on social media, how social media are used by an organization, the comments potentially on an advertising campaign or whatever. Data from social media is usually not secondary data, so you will have to take some precautions, and I'm going to develop them in a few minutes. So although they are in the public domain, they are not exactly considered as being in the public domain, and I will clarify that shortly. So first, a big type of data, secondary data. Another big type of data, the main one, if you are conducting primary research, is primary data. So the idea of primary data is you collect data yourself as a researcher to be able to have the right data, the relevant data to answer your research question, okay? Typically, for primary data collection, you will do things such as an interview, a focus group. Potentially, you might conduct experiments or observations. These are unlikely to happen for you and that period of time, but interviews and focus group could happen, or you may use a questionnaire. So you will either have qualitative data or quantitative data. If you plan to collect primary data, I think the first thing I need to clarify is your dissertation is not going to be better or have a better grade because you collected primary data. Your dissertation would be good, excellent, if you have useful data, and more importantly, if you use it appropriately, if you do something relevant with that. And clearly, there are lots of other things, such as your literature review, your theoretical framework, etc., etc. Some of the best dissertations I've marked over the years were using secondary data. and they were excellent dissertations. And in the same way, I've also marked very poor dissertations with primary data. Not because primary data is bad, but because collecting primary data is a bit more challenging. And doing it might mean that you have a good end result, but in itself, having primary data is not a guarantee of having a good grade. Okay, so please don't think you need to have primary data to have an excellent or a good dissertation. You just need to have the right data and use it appropriately. And it might be that secondary data is perfect for you. It might be that primary data is more appropriate. If you do plan to collect primary data, there are a few more things you need to do. So the process of ethics is going to be a bit more complicated, and the review might take a little bit longer. Nothing drastic if you are rigorous, but you need to think of a few things. So the first one is you need to think about consent. Whoever is taking part in your data need to be able to give you consent, and you want to think about the whole process about gaining consent. And I'm going to cover that more explicitly in a few minutes. You need to assess whether there are any risks for the participants or any risks for you as a researcher. Okay, and potentially you need to also assess whether there are any risks for the university. Okay, whether there are legal risks or reputation risks. Typically, the kind of risk we want you to be protected against and your participants to be protected against are risks about physical risks, but also maybe emotional risks. What we mean by that would be an example of physical risk would be if today you wanted to conduct face-to-face interviews. Right now, the position of the university would be to say, no, sorry, it's not possible. Because of COVID, we try to avoid face-to-face interactions as much as possible. And although you could have an interview where you keep your distance, the university will very, very strongly recommend that you do those interviews online, just to limit the physical risk. An example of emotional risks could be if you were, I'm thinking maybe of the HR students here, you wanted to explore harassment in the workplace and try to get a feel of how people feel about it, whether they've experienced it, and so on. And although it would be a very interesting topic, you can imagine that if you were to speak with someone who has been harassed, potentially there are emotions there which will re-emerge to the surface, and that could be quite risky for the participant. And it could also be risky for you as a researcher, because some of the things you might discuss might also disturb you a little bit. It doesn't mean you cannot do that research, but it just means you would need to be quite cautious in how you prepare things, present things, just to try and make sure you minimize risk as much as possible. And one of the key things that we need to remember, the last one, is also about data and data protection. Okay, so there are a number of rules around that. So you need to think about not only the data when you will collect it in the first place, but also how you will store it, how you will use it, and whether you will destroy it, and how and when. Okay, so that you can ensure anonymity, so that there is no private, personal, or sensitive data which is potentially floating around and being communicated. So I did mention it, but I really want to emphasize it. Face-to-face interviews or questionnaires will not be accepted this semester. Okay, if for whatever reason you think you would really need to do it, speak with me. You can have a chat with your supervisor first, but speak with me as well. I can't really think of many reasons why you would need to do that. Okay, I have students PhD students who are doing their research on football in China, on tourism in South Korea, on the Olympics in Japan, and they are doing, and a couple of them are actually in Korea and Japan, because they went there to collect interviews, and they are not doing those interviews online. Okay, and it's actually working very well. There's no reason why you can't do it properly. That means that things such as participant observations is not really going to be possible either this semester. Okay, because it would expose you in being in an organization, potentially being close to other people and so on. So usually we will try to avoid that as much as possible. Okay. Questionnaire, the same. administering your questionnaire online is actually quite often more efficient, and that would be your preferred option this semester. So I've started touching on that, and here you have a clearer, I think, information of the key things we need to cover for primary research. So when you plan to collect primary data, you need to ensure that your participants are fully informed about the research project. Okay, and that covers a range of things from the objectives of your project, its purpose, your aim, what you are trying to achieve, through the kind of things you will ask them. So you'll have to fill a questionnaire, you will have to go through an interview, it will last roughly 40 minutes or whatever. But also explaining a little bit more the kind of data you will collect and why you collect that data. Okay. The idea is that participants will then be able to somehow appreciate the risk they might take, but will also get all the information about why this research is being conducted and how they can withdraw. Okay. Ultimately, once they've got that information, they're in a position to give consent. They cannot give consent if they don't know what they're consenting to. Okay, so they need to know what they are consenting to first. Then they can give consent, and it's what we call an informed consent. And what we want to make sure here is that this consent is given freely, so without coercion. So what we mean here is, let's imagine again we are looking at HR. You're interested to see employees' perception about, I don't know, the pay and reward system, and you're planning to conduct a questionnaire, maybe, and you circulate the questionnaire to the employees. That's fine, and it's up to them to respond. But if there is an email coming from the CEO of the organization or the HR director saying, okay, please find attached the questionnaire, and we strongly recommend you to take part, it's already the three consent is maybe not as explicit. Okay, there is an element of coercion, there is an element of being forced to take part. So we want to avoid those kind of situations as much as possible. And sorry. And finally, the last point is about the right to withdraw. Okay, participants need to give their consent to participate, so to engage in the research, but they have also the right to withdraw their participation, basically at any time, and without giving any reasons, and without any consequences. Okay, so they should not be affected by the fact that they withdraw. They don't have to justify themselves. They can withdraw before starting. So they might say, yeah, I'm happy to do an interview. And then the day before the interview, they tell you, sorry, actually, no, I don't want to do this interview. That's fine. They can withdraw during the process of data collection. So they could stop at some point in the interview or decide not to answer some of the questions. And similarly, in the questionnaire, they could just close their browser, for example, and their response will not be recorded, okay, or will not be recorded further. So they can withdraw there. But they can also withdraw after they participated. So you conduct an interview or you collect a questionnaire from them, and a few days later, they contact you and they say, sorry, actually, you know what, I don't want to be part of that research anymore. You need to withdraw them from the process. Obviously, you can only do that in some cases. There would be a point after which it's no longer possible for you to do it. So if you conduct interviews, normally you will have an identifier, so you will know which interview relate to what respondent, which respondent. So you will always more or less be able to withdraw them. But if you've already submitted your dissertation, for example, well, that's it. You can delete their data, but you cannot withdraw them from the things which have already been published. That's fine. If you collect a questionnaire, it might be that it's anonymous. Okay, people log in. They don't have to put their name or whatever. They just click on a link. They give their consent. They start the questionnaire. And if they submit it at the end, it's recorded. But there is no way for you to know who submitted that questionnaire. And therefore, they could potentially contact you, but you don't know what questionnaire to remove because it's already been fully anonymized. Okay, so these are basically the limitations. And we will see that one of the other things we need to do in terms of protecting data would be to also have a date for data disposal. And that's something I will cover in a few minutes. Okay, so secondary data which is already there. You still need to do an ethics application, but it's going to be fairly straightforward. Primary data you collect yourself, typically through interviews or questionnaires. And to be able to do that, you need to go through the ethics process, but it's a bit more complicated because you need to think about a number of things, and some of them are about the participant information, how they can give their consent, and so on. Now, when we spoke about secondary data, I told you social media, unfortunately or fortunately, is not considered as secondary data. Why is it? You could find this information in the public domain, so why is it not secondary data? Well, there's one main reason for that, is even if the data is public, very often whoever posted the message, commented, was not necessarily intending for it to be public. They might have known that in the back of their mind, but they are just interacting with someone. So I don't know, an organization is tweeting, a customer is responding to the tweet or commenting on it, or commenting on a Facebook post or those kind of things. No, they are just interacting with the organization. They are not necessarily thinking, oh, the whole world is seeing it. So that's the first reason. The second reason is it's much more difficult to anonymize. Because if you quote things directly, well, I can take the quote, type it on Google, and it's quite likely that I will be able to find the initial post because it's something which is public. Okay, and by doing that, I would then be able to identify the person, and they might have used a pseudonym or whatever, but still, I can potentially build their history there. So social media and data from social media, we will usually consider that as primary data collection, and therefore you need to be cautious about it. There is one exception to that. It's if you are looking at the official accounts from organizations or the official accounts of public figures. So if you know you're interested in how sports stars use or musicians, artists use their social media accounts and in a way becomes influencers. And that can be to develop their own personal branding, or it could be because they've got endorsements and sponsorships and things like that. So you are looking, let's say, at Federer Instagram account, and you are looking at what he is posting. Not necessarily the comments, or the comments you look at them in a different way, but what he is posting. In that case, clearly, he did that knowing it was going to be public. And because you will very explicitly say in your dissertation that you are looking at Federer's social media, there is no problem in terms of identification, okay? Because that's your case, it's delineated. So in that case, potentially you don't have any problem. But if you are looking at the comments, if you are looking at individuals, not public figures, you need to be more cautious. However, there's not necessarily a need for specific attachments, but there would be a need to anonymize everything. There would be a need for not quoting directly. So you will need to paraphrase. You need to say, okay, customers were unhappy about it, customers were happy about it, customers were expressing this, or whoever was saying that, and so on. But trying not to quote directly. And you will need to check the terms and conditions of the platform. Okay, because basically, they are within a social media, and they might have conditions saying you cannot use them for research purpose or whatever. In many cases, it's okay, but you need to double check. So the key point to remember is whatever you are doing, no data collection should take place before ethical clearance is obtained. If you are using secondary data, in a way, you are not collecting data because data is already there. So you could start the process without having ethical clearance. And I guess all of you, to some extent, have started the process because you've done a literature review, for example. And you may have started looking at a few reports or databases which were out there. But you would still need to get an ethical clearance before you submit. Okay. The reason why we need ethical clearance and go through an ethical application is to protect yourself, against the risk we've mentioned, the physical risk, emotional risk, potentially against legal risks, because you might have liability issues if you were saying things which were not appropriate and so on. It's to protect the respondents we've mentioned those, and also to to protect the university and the reputation of the university. Okay, so you don't want to create damage. I think there is a more general picture there. Is you want to be able to showcase an image of professionalism. Okay, and the university wants you to showcase an image of professionalism because we don't want to damage our reputation, and we don't want to damage relationship we might have with organization. So it's important to go through that process as well for that reason. Is there any question at this stage? And because I can't see you, what I'll do is I will just count to 10. And if you want to speak, you speak. Otherwise, I'll assume there is no question.
I have a question.
Yeah, go
on. So if you wanted to do a case study, would that be primary data?
Case study in itself is kind of a broader element of methods, but what will you do in your case study? What data will you use for your case study? This is the question. So if your case study is, I don't know, I think you are interested in snooker, James.
Yeah.
So I don't know what your case study is, whether it's snooker, whether it's a specific organization within that. But the question becomes, what data will you use? If you only use data which is in the public domain, from website, from the website of the organization, press release, press coverage, and so on, then it's secondary data. If you are planning to do an interview with the CEO of the organization, with players, with fans, then you will have primary data. Okay, so case study is just delineating the context in a way, but you will still need to find data to create that case, to populate this information. Does that make sense? Or?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Is there any other question? Okay, it seems fine. So I'll move on, and remember we'll have time for questions at the end anyway. So key points: no data collection before getting approval. Some of the key things you need to check when you do your application, and more generally speaking, I guess, when you think about your research, is what is your topic about? Is it going to be a sensitive topic? And we are all in business and management. Chances are most of the topics we are discussing are not overly sensitive. We have colleagues in health and life science who might play with human tissues, or who might look at children's education, so potentially they engage with younger people. You might have things there which are a bit more touchy. In our case, very often it is not, but in some cases it might be. I mentioned, for example, if you are looking at harassment in the workplace, clearly you have a topic here which is highly important, but also very sensitive. So you need to be cautious about how you approach it. If you were thinking about, you may have followed the news recently about, for example, the NBA players saying, okay, or NFL players in North America in sports saying, well, we don't feel comfortable with racism in America. No, you might have a topic here which again becomes a little bit more political, a little bit more sensitive, but you can probably discuss it relatively well. But then if you start discussing about, I remember last year we had cases about some of the NBA teams supporting demonstrators in Hong Kong who were trying to express themselves and saying, okay, they should be free to express themselves. And then there were some others who were a bit afraid of reactions from China about it. You start having something which is a little bit more sensitive, especially if you ask the opinion of people in Hong Kong, for example, about the support they might have received from those organizations. Because the way they respond could potentially be used against them. So they are no longer free to express themselves, because if they say something negative, potentially they could end up in jail. So you will have a topic here which is highly sensitive. And you need to think about, are you going to put your respondent in a very difficult situation by asking them questions, which might be emotionally, politically, or whatever, sensitive, etc., etc. Again, it doesn't mean you cannot do it, but it means you need to be careful about it. So if you're interested in looking at harassment in the workplace, why not? No, it's an important topic, so we shouldn't not do it just because it's difficult. But you need to think of ways to approach it, which is, safe enough for both for you and for the respondents. So it could be that you provide links for support, that you make sure that there is space for them to withdraw a little bit from the process and come back to it. You make sure maybe that your questions are not probing and are not too personal, or maybe you encourage them to comment on situations which don't directly affect them, rather than those which potentially might have directly affected them. So you need to find ways around that. You need to think about your sampling and your recruitment process. Okay, and provide some details about this. So who are you going to interview? Who are you going to ask questions to, send your questionnaire to? Okay, they need to be the relevant people. So this is not just an ethical issue, it's very much an issue in terms of the design of your research. They need to be the relevant people to provide you the relevant information to help you address your research question. You need to think of how you will reach them. You're thinking, okay, I'm going to have an online questionnaire. Fine, but where do you put it? How do you put it somewhere where you will hope you will reach the right respondents and you will reach a sufficient number of respondents? What do you do? So you need to think beyond that, which is about the data collection channels and venues. Okay, and I would want you to be cautious about two things. One is going through someone, whether it's an organization, an individual, or website, to gain access to respondents. If you do that, you will need to have them confirming their position as a gatekeeper. Okay, so typically, if you were planning to interview employees of an organization and you go through it, or you speak with them, through the organization, again, one, remember about them being free to give consent, but two, you need the organization to confirm that they're happy to act as a gatekeeper and to open their doors to you. If you are planning to contact customers of an organization, again, the organization would be a gatekeeper. So you need specific letters and so on from them. Covert observation, clearly we don't want to go into that, although it creates ethical issues, but it could sometimes be a very appropriate method to allow for triangulations and make sure there is no biases and so on. But we will try to avoid that, and so ideally you want to make sure you are not doing any covert observation. But I guess this semester it's not going to be an issue because you shouldn't conduct observation anyway. And the last point you need to think about is about confidentiality and anonymity. Okay, how do you make sure that you will protect your participants throughout the project? And in some cases, they might be very happy to be named. Okay, you're speaking with the marketing director of 2 or 3 different organizations, and you want their perspective, and they are very happy to speak, with their name and their organization to be recognized and so on. But even if they are happy, there's pretty no real need for you to do it in your dissertation. So very often you will try to think about maintaining confidentiality and anonymity. Okay, so I'm just going now to give you a very brief recap. Secondary data, your application should be fairly straightforward. You need to explain what you're planning to do, but you don't really need to attach anything because you don't collect any data. If you plan to collect any primary data, we would expect you to provide some attachments at the end. So when you answer the questionnaire for ethics, you will have more sections opening up because there are a little bit more risks. So you can provide information. Most of the questions are just yes, no, but in some cases you've got a comment box where you can develop. And you will also need to attach some documentation. what your supervisors and myself would require is, at the very least, these top 3 documents. Okay, the participant information sheet. And I'll show you the template in a minute. So this is basically a document which gives potential participants all the information they need about the research you are going to conduct. You need a consent form. So you need a way to collect consent from the participant. And this consent is an informed consent because they have their participant information first. And you need to include your data collection instruments. What does that mean? It means you need to include your questionnaire if you're planning to conduct a questionnaire. Not the questionnaire filled by the respondent, but the list of questions and the items you will have in your questionnaire. If you plan to do an interview, you need to have your interview guide. So you need to have the main broad topic areas you're going to discuss during your interview. Okay. And that's really important because although you will see that the ethics deadline, you've got a few more weeks, 3 weeks, 3.5 weeks before the deadline, actually you need to have done quite a lot of things by that time. You know, you need to be ready to start your data collection. You need to have your questionnaire ready. You need to have your interview guide ready. And to have a questionnaire ready or an interview guide ready means you need to have conducted your literature review because you need to have, you know, a very clear theoretical framework in mind already. So there are quite a lot of things you need to do in a fairly short period of time. Potentially, you might have an health and safety risk assessment, but I think this semester, if you don't do any face-to-face things, if you don't travel, I suspect you won't really need to do that risk assessment as such. Potentially, you might need a gatekeeper permission if you go through an organization to get respondents. Okay, so the main things: participant information sheet, consent form, and your interview guide or your questionnaire. Your interview guide or questionnaire, they are yours. There cannot be any template because it's specific to your research. But participant information, consent form, there are very specific documents and there are templates for that. So I'm going to show you the template and you've got the link here to those documents. So bear with me while it's opening. So once you were in Eithics and you see that I haven't logged in yet, but I can still access these documents, okay? So even if you haven't created your account, you should be able to see them. In that documentation section, you have generic thing at the top, and these 3 documents are the one I showed you earlier. But the key bit for you is this one here, participant information and consent. If you are planning to do interviews and focus groups, okay, whether they are online or whether they would be face-to-face, but in your case, they would be online or virtual through Skype, through Teams, through WeChat, through whatever. You need to use these documents. Okay, the informed consent, I will start with that one, is very simple. It's very much a tick box. So you open the document, and the key thing is you need to update it to your research. Okay. So it says informed consent form, research title. I don't want to see any submission with this here. You need to replace that by your own research title. You need to replace that bit by your own research aim. Okay. And then the form is like that. Potentially check whether all those sections are relevant to you. If they are not, maybe you can remove them. And here you have a block. Okay. It says, please delete all brown and red text prior to use. So make sure you delete it. Read it, see whether you need to change anything, and then delete it. Okay. And then you can, once you've updated all that, you can attach it to your application. And that's it. That's the only thing you need to do for the consent form. So we're not asking you to attach consent which is already signed. We're asking you to attach the form that you will send to participants to collect their consent. Okay. Once you start the process of collecting data, you will send that document to your participants, and they will need to say yes, 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 or no, no, no. and sign at the end and send it back to you. The other document, before they give you consent, they need to be able to know what your research is about. So if you click on participant information sheet here, that will open a template, and there is a lot more to change in that document because it presents your project. Okay, so every section which is written in capital letter and in bracket like that, you need to change, you need to update. So you need to put your project title here, you need to say what your subject is, you need to give your name, remember that you are a student at Coventry University. Here you need to summarize the purpose of your research. Okay, so you've got some explanations of what you need to do. You don't need to write 10 pages, a few lines is fine, but you need to provide that information. Why you've been chosen to take part, okay, you've been chosen because we think you will provide useful information, because you have access to this, because you're interested in customers' perception of blah, 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 and so on. Okay, so go through the documents, update it, make sure you change every single thing that needs to be changed, and obviously that you also keep the bits that do not have to be changed. So you only change the sections in brackets or which are written in a strange color. International data transfer, that would not apply to you. That would only be if you were transferring data to another country or potentially collecting data in another country and therefore being in that other country first. But if you use OneDrive, if you do all those things, normally you will not need that. Okay, so the template has been prepared for you. You don't have to think about the legal aspect and so on, but you still need to update it to make sure it reflects your own research. And I'm insisting a little bit on that because you would be amazed by the number of people who submit something without changing some of the sections. And that means it has to be rejected. It has to go back to you for editing. So everybody is losing time. And the process, once you submit it, I'm not going to look at it immediately. I might be busy on that day, I might have meeting the following day, and maybe I will look at it only 2 days later. And 2 days later, I realize there is a problem, I send it back to you. And you are a little bit busy on that day, you only are able to deal with it the following evening. Now, the whole process has been delayed by a few days simply because that hasn't been updated. So please be careful with that thing. So if you conduct interviews, you need that participant information and you need the informed consent. If you collect questionnaires, you administer questionnaire, you don't need these, you need to do something else. I suspect in most cases, you will have anonymous data. Okay, you will collect a questionnaire and you don't need to know who responded to your questionnaire. Typically, you try to get the perceptions of customers or potential customers about something. In which case, you can use that template here, online questionnaire, participant information, and consent, so it's all together anonymous data. And if you look at this document, again, it's been prepared for you, but you need to update and adapt all the sections which are in bracket to your project, okay? So you will have here a very short presentation about what your project is about. So that's the participant information part. And at the end, you will have a first question. So a question which is mandatory, where you are basically collecting consent. So people will say, I've read and understood the above information, understand, blah, 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 and therefore I give my consent. And I tick. And if they tick that box, then they can move on to the rest of your questionnaire. If they don't tick that box, they haven't given you consent, they cannot access the rest of your questionnaire. Okay, so that would be the way for you to collect consent, and it's a lot easier to do it that way when you're administering questionnaires online. Just one small thing here. I don't know if you can see, because I appreciate that when I share my screen, maybe things are a little bit tiny on your screen, but I have highlighted here a section which says, I confirm that I am age 18 or over. Okay. We assume that people can only give consent if they are adults. And there are other things. So if someone has, I don't know, dementia, they might not be in a position to give you consent. So if you were looking at specific groups of people, you might also have to be a little bit careful to make sure that they can give you consent. If you wanted to speak with people in a language which is not their own language, they might not be in a position to give you consent, which is fully informed, because they don't necessarily understand everything. So potentially you need to tweak those things. But this bit about age is important. If for whatever reason you think your research has to have the point of view of children, please speak with your supervisor, speak with myself, and we'll see how we can go around that. Most of the time, you can find a way to collect relevant information without speaking with the children, but asking the perspective of the parents, for example. Okay. So that's I think a crucial point in terms of health and safety as well, more broadly speaking. Any questions? Okay, so I'll keep going, and we're almost done. And I'll go back to the main screen so you can see me properly. I can see you more, and we can have a bit more of an interaction. So remember, attach all the required documents if you plan to collect primary data. Use the right templates and update them to your project. If you are planning to do an online questionnaire, you can only use online surveys. And I've given you the link here. You will have an account directly through the university. Okay, this is an academic tool. It supports lots of different fonts. I had students collecting data in Korea, in Japan, in China, in Greece, and they were able to write things using local fonts inside. So you are able to really adapt it to the country, and it works behind the firewall normally. So you should also not have any problem if you are planning to collect data in China or in countries where there is a firewall. Other platforms are not approved by the university. So you are not allowed to use Google Form, to use SurveyMonkey, to use any other things. You can only use online surveys. Okay. The reason for that are a bit complex, but by and large, it's about data protection. A number of those other platforms will have their main server outside of the EU, and the UK is still in the EU for now. And therefore, there are risks about data there, or risk at least in the sense that they don't necessarily abide by the same privacy laws. And some of those platforms also have issues in terms of ownership of the data. So they might say that actually the data which is being collected you can use, but it becomes their data, and that's problematic for us. So you can only use online surveys. Okay. And one last very important thing, if you collect data, you will be asked at some point to provide the date for data disposal. That would be in your participant information, but that would also be in your ethics application. The date has to be the 15th of December 2021, okay, in 1 year time. The reason for that is simply that you might have, a health issue at some point and you need to defer, or you might have your assignment is not as good as you were hoping and you need to resit. And therefore there would be delays, and you will still need to be able to use the data you've collected. Okay, so to make sure that you are protected and you can keep using the data, we ask you to put that date of 15th of December 2021 as date for data disposal. And that means ideally by then, potentially before, if you've submitted everything, you've got your grade, there is no appeal, there is no problem, potentially before you can delete it, but at least by that date, you will delete it. Last thing, deadlines. I think Hani might have communicated that to you already, but the submission deadline, so the latest date by which you can submit your ethics application is the 9th of October. The approval deadline for your supervisor and potentially a reviewer to approve your application is the 16th of October. Between those 2 days, there might be a few iterations. I would really strongly encourage you not to submit your application on the 9th at the very last minute, okay? If possible, discuss with your supervisor earlier and submit a first draft, at least, of your application earlier. Because quite often, even if it's very good, there might be a few things that you need to tweak, and there might be 1 or 2 iterations. And it takes a few days, usually, when you send it. By the time your supervisor go through it again, send it back to you, by the time you change things, it takes a few days. Ideally, you don't want to have this rush happening between that week from the 9th to the 16th, because there would be lots of people at that time. So keep that deadline in mind and try to anticipate it and submit earlier if you can. So I'm done with the formal part. I will go back to the main presentation now, and we can have a Q&A, we can have a break. I will stay online, but I would encourage you afterwards to go on Eithics and to start creating your profile and potentially start looking at the fields you are there. You may not be in a position yet to fill everything, but at least you can start playing with it. Okay, so let me go back to here. Do you have any questions? I cannot see any questions on the, oh, sorry, I realized that. Did you receive my my PowerPoint? Probably not. Okay. So is there any other question? You're all very quiet. Can I assume that everything is perfect? Shujie, are you still with us? Do you have a question? Adebola?
No, I'm good. I'm good. Thank you.
I'm not picking only one particularly. I'm just randomly selecting names.
Yeah, I know. I understand.
Yubo? Elvis?
Yes, I'm fine.
Fine, okay. Elvis?
Yeah, I'm fine.
Okay. Well, if you're all happy with that, hopefully you can access my slide. Can you access them or not?
Hi, Benoit, thank you so much. They should be able to access everything. Is already in Aula.
Okay.
Just gonna end a stop recording so I can right away upload this also there.
Yes, and then we can keep discussing.